Tad Mitchell had learned early that survival wasn't about waiting for help, it was about finding it. At just 11 years old, he had already become an expert at spotting half-empty bottles in alleyways, digging through dumpsters quickly enough to avoid trouble, and slipping in and out of public places without drawing attention. He knew which gas stations let people use the bathroom without asking questions, and which librarians wouldn't mind if a boy sat reading for hours as long as he didn't make a sound. But none of that changed the cold creeping into his bones as the February wind tore through the thin fabric of his jacket, or the sharp hunger gnawing at his stomach as he counted the bottles in his plastic bag. 17, not enough. The recycling center paid 5 cents per bottle, and he needed at least 30 to afford a loaf of bread from the discount store. Even that wouldn't be enough to last, not with his mother needing food more than he did, but it was a start. Shivering, he wiped his runny nose on his sleeve and kept searching. Behind the downtown buildings, the streets were emptier than usual. People didn't linger outside in this kind of cold, unless they had no choice. Tad checked behind Ray's Pizza, hoping the dumpster might hold something edible, but the lid was locked with a new chain. "Sorry, kid," Ray called from the back door, wiping his hands on a greasy towel. "Health inspector's been cracking down. Can't leave it open anymore." He glanced around quickly and then, as if making a split-second decision, slipped a small paper bag into Tad's hands. "But I accidentally made an extra sandwich. Just don't tell anyone, okay?" Tad clutched the bag to his chest, feeling the warmth seep through his fingers. He wanted to eat it right there, but he knew better. Mom hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. He forced himself to tuck the bag under his jacket and murmured, "Thanks, Mr. Ray," before turning back toward the parking lot where their old blue Honda sat hidden behind overgrown bushes. Mom always said parking in the same spot too long was risky, but she had been too sick to drive much lately. Tad checked for police cars before approaching. Last week, Officer Martinez had knocked on their window, saying they couldn't sleep in the car. Mama had smiled through the glass, explaining they were just resting during her break from a long shift at the hospital. She didn't mention that she had lost that job 3 months ago when her illness got too bad to work. "Mom," Tad whispered, tapping the foggy window. Inside, wrapped in all their blankets, his mother stirred slowly. Her face was puffy today, which was never a good sign. "Hey, baby," she rasped, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Any luck?" Tad held up his bag of bottles and then the paper bag from Ray's. 17 bottles so far. And look, Ray gave us food." His mother tried to smile, but Tad saw how much it hurt her. "My little provider," she said, ruffling his hair. "But you know we talked about not taking food from strangers." "Ray's not a stranger, Mom," Tad argued, unwrapping the sandwich carefully. "He's nice. And anyway, I checked, it's fresh." He broke it in half, handing her the bigger piece. She tried to give it back, but he shook his head. "You need it more, and medicine works better with food. That's what you always told your patients, remember?" A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. Tad pretended not to notice. He was getting good at pretending he didn't hear her crying at night, pretending he wasn't scared when strangers walked too close to their car, pretending he didn't miss his old school and his friends. "I applied for disability again," his mother murmured between small bites. "The social worker at the clinic is helping this time. Maybe—" She trailed off, but Tad knew what she meant. Maybe this time they'd get approved. Maybe this time they'd get real help. Maybe this time things would change. But maybes didn't keep you warm at night. Tad had learned that the hard way. "I saw signs for a big event downtown tomorrow," Tad said, changing the subject. "Some kind of political thing. They might have extra food after." Mom frowned. "Tad, we talked about this. It's not safe." "I'll be careful," he promised. "Nobody even notices kids at those things. And sometimes they have whole boxes of sandwiches left over." Before she could argue more, a coughing fit overtook her. Tad quickly grabbed their last water bottle, helping her drink slowly. Her hands trembled as she held the bottle, and guilt gnawed at his stomach worse than hunger. If he was better at finding bottles, or braver about asking for help, or smarter at figuring out solutions. When her coughing settled, she leaned back against the seat. "Just promise me," she whispered. "Be careful tomorrow. No talking to strangers. No going anywhere alone. And if you see Officer Martinez—" I know," Tad interrupted. "Say we're just passing through." He tucked the blankets around her shoulders and kissed her forehead. "Try to sleep, Mom. I'm going to check the other side of the parking lot for more bottles." Outside, he pretended not to notice how her hands clutched the blanket, or how her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Instead, he focused on counting his steps, on scanning the ground for the glint of glass or plastic, on anything except the gnawing fear that grew bigger every day. Tomorrow would be better. There would be food at the rally, maybe enough to last a few days, and maybe, just maybe, someone there would know how to help them. Tad didn't believe in wishes anymore, but sometimes when the night got too cold or his mom's cough got too bad, he still made them anyway. He looked up at the gray February sky and whispered, "Please." He didn't know who he was asking. He didn't even know what exactly he was asking for. He just knew they couldn't keep living like this much longer. Something had to change. A siren wailed in the distance, making him jump. Time to move. He hitched his bottle bag higher on his shoulder and headed deeper into the maze of Columbus streets, searching for any small treasure that might help keep them alive another day. The next morning dawned bright and bitter cold. Tad's breath made little clouds as he hurried through the growing crowd downtown. Campaign signs bobbed like colorful flags above people's heads, and the sound of a microphone being tested echoed off the tall buildings. Perfect. The bigger the crowd, the easier it would be to blend in. He spotted what he was looking for, folding tables near the back stacked with water bottles and boxed lunches. His heart beat faster. If he timed it right, he could grab something when everyone was distracted by the speeches. "Here for the rally, young man?" a woman with a clipboard asked, smiling. "Where are your parents?" "My dad's up front," Tad lied smoothly. "He sent me to get water." She nodded, already distracted by someone asking for directions. Tad slipped past her, working his way toward the food tables. The smell of sandwiches made his stomach cramp. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice boomed over the speakers. "Please welcome our next speaker." Perfect timing. As the crowd surged forward, Tad moved backward, almost there, just a few more steps. Wham! He crashed into something solid. No, someone. A tall man in an expensive suit. Tad stumbled, his bottle bag clattering to the ground, empty containers rolling everywhere. "I'm sorry," Tad gasped, dropping to his knees to gather the bottles. His hands shook. Getting noticed was the last thing he wanted. "Here, let me help," the man said, kneeling beside him. His voice was kind, with a hint of an accent Tad couldn't place. Not angry at all, which somehow made it worse. "It's fine," Tad mumbled, not looking up. "I've got it." The man picked up a bottle, studying it. "My grandmother used to collect these," he said. "She told me it was honest work, even if some people looked down on it." Tad froze. Most people pretended not to see what he was doing. But this man? There was something different in his voice. Understanding. Tad Mitchell had never thought much about what it meant to be poor, not until the day everything changed. Before his mom got sick, they had lived in a small but cozy apartment with bright yellow kitchen walls that she had painted herself. There had been home-cooked meals, bedtime stories, and morning rushes to school with a packed lunch and a note tucked inside reminding him to do his best. His mother had been a nurse, and though money had always been tight, they had managed. But when the symptoms started, when her hands swelled so badly she could no longer hold a syringe steady, when the fatigue became unbearable, everything began to unravel. She took time off, thinking she just needed rest, but time off meant no pay. No pay meant no rent meant eviction. And suddenly their whole world had shrunk to the inside of an old blue Honda parked behind an abandoned Kmart. Now, every day was about survival. Tad woke up to stiff joints from sleeping, curled up in the passenger seat, rubbing warmth back into his fingers before checking on his mother. Some days she was alert enough to talk to him, to smile even, but other days she barely had the energy to lift her head. Those were the worst. He would hand her the last of their water, watch as she forced herself to drink, and pretend he didn't notice the way she winced with every movement. When she was having a better day, she would remind him to wash up before heading out, pressing a small bottle of hand sanitizer into his palm like it was some kind of shield against the world. He had learned which public bathrooms were the safest, which gas stations wouldn't ask questions, and which library sinks had the warmest water to clean up before trying to blend in with the other kids, who had homes to return to at the end of the day. But blending in didn't change the fact that he was always hungry. It didn't change the way his stomach twisted painfully as he passed a bakery, the scent of fresh bread torturing him. It didn't change the way his mother always gave him the larger half of whatever food they managed to find, no matter how much he protested. Some days there was nothing at all. Those were the days he hated most. The days when his mother would smile weakly and tell him she wasn't hungry, even though he knew better. He had learned early that arguing wouldn't change her mind, so instead, he found ways to make sure she ate first. Collecting bottles and cans had become his main source of income. It wasn't much, but it was something. He scoured alleyways, searched through public trash cans, and walked for miles looking for anything that could be turned into a few cents at the recycling center. On a good day, he could collect enough to buy a loaf of bread or a couple of instant ramen packs. On a bad day, he came back empty-handed, stomach aching with disappointment. He had tried other things, watching for dropped coins on the sidewalk, checking vending machine slots, even considering asking strangers for money. But he knew his mother wouldn't approve. She had made him promise, over and over, that no matter how hard things got, they would never beg. He had also learned how to read people. He could tell who would ignore him, who would look away in discomfort, and who might actually help. Most people didn't notice him at all, which was exactly how he wanted it. The less attention he drew, the safer he and his mother were. But every once in a while, someone like Ray from the pizza shop would slip him a sandwich or a bottle of water, and for those moments, Tad allowed himself to believe that not everyone had forgotten them. Nights were the hardest. The car provided some shelter, but it was never warm enough in winter. No matter how many blankets they had, the cold always found a way in. His mother's cough had gotten worse lately, rattling in her chest like something was breaking inside her. He knew she needed medicine, real medicine, not just the expired bottles she rationed carefully. But without insurance and without money, there was nothing he could do except watch and hope that tomorrow would be a little better. The fear was always there too, the fear that one day a cop wouldn't believe their story and would force them out of the car, that someone would report them to social services and he'd be taken away from his mother, that she would get too sick to wake up one morning and he'd be left completely alone. He had no backup plan, no one to call, no one who even knew where they were. They had tried staying with friends at first, but people could only help so much before they started making excuses. I wish we could do more. We just don't have the space. Maybe next week. Until eventually, there were no more offers. His mother kept saying it was temporary, that they just needed to hold on until the disability application went through, until she got better, until something changed. But Tad wasn't sure how much longer they could keep going like this. Hope was a fragile thing, and his was running out. That was why the rally had seemed like a good idea. He had seen signs for it around town, and political events always had food. People got so caught up in the speeches and handshakes that no one noticed if a few extra sandwiches disappeared. If he was lucky, he might be able to grab enough to last them a couple of days, maybe even a whole week, if he was really careful. The morning of the rally, he had left before his mother woke up, promising himself he'd bring something back. He had slipped through the growing crowd downtown, weaving between campaign volunteers and banners, his eyes locked on the tables stacked with boxed lunches and bottled water near the back. He had almost made it, almost reached his goal, when he crashed into a man in an expensive suit. Bottles clattered to the ground, rolling in all directions. Tad's heart pounded as he scrambled to pick them up, his fingers shaking. He couldn't afford to lose even one. "I'm sorry," he gasped, ducking his head, trying to make himself smaller. He had learned that the best way to avoid trouble was to avoid eye contact, to move quickly, to get away before anyone had a chance to ask questions. But instead of brushing him off, the man knelt down beside him. "Here, let me help," he said, picking up a bottle and handing it to Tad. His voice was calm, kind, not angry, not pitying, just understanding. Tad hesitated. Most people either ignored him or looked at him with the kind of forced sympathy that made him want to disappear. But there was something different about this man. He wasn't looking at Tad like he was a problem to be solved or a nuisance to be brushed aside. He was just looking at him, seeing him. "You collect these for recycling, right?" the man asked, holding up a bottle. "My grandmother used to do the same thing when I was a kid. Said it was honest work, even if some people looked down on it." Tad froze. No one had ever said that before. Most people pretended not to notice what he was doing, but this man, He understood. For the first time in a long time, Tad felt something shift inside him, a flicker of something he had almost forgotten: hope. The rally was louder than Tad had expected, the air filled with the hum of excited conversations, the crackling of a microphone being adjusted, and the occasional cheer from clusters of supporters, waving signs high above their heads. It was the kind of event where people talked about big changes and bold promises, but Tad wasn't interested in politics. He was interested in the long tables near the back, stacked with water bottles and boxed lunches. His stomach clenched at the sight of the neatly packed sandwiches, and he forced himself to stay focused. If he timed it right, if he blended in just enough, he could grab one, maybe even two, before anyone noticed. Food like that would last him and his mother for days if he rationed it carefully. He pulled his hood lower over his face, weaving through the crowd, keeping his eyes locked on his target. A woman with a clipboard suddenly stepped into his path, smiling warmly. "Here for the rally, young man? Where are your parents?" Tad barely hesitated. "Up front," he lied smoothly, nodding toward the throng of people gathered near the stage. "My dad sent me to grab some water." She nodded, already distracted by another attendee asking for directions, and he slipped past her without a second glance. The smell of sandwiches was stronger now, making his stomach tighten painfully. He edged closer, waiting for the right moment, scanning for the best way to slip a few into his bag unnoticed. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice suddenly boomed over the speakers. "Please welcome our next speaker." Perfect. As the crowd surged forward, drawn toward the stage, Tad moved in the opposite direction. Everyone's attention was elsewhere. He was almost there, just a few more steps. And then he crashed into someone, hard. His bag of bottles slipped from his shoulder, hitting the pavement with a loud clatter, the plastic rolling in every direction. He barely had time to register what had happened before he looked up, his heart pounding. The man he had slammed into was tall, wearing a crisp, expensive suit, the kind that made Tad immediately wary. People in suits didn't usually have time for kids like him. They either ignored him completely or looked at him with the kind of pity that made his skin crawl. "I'm sorry," Tad blurted, scrambling to his knees to gather his bottles. His fingers shook as he reached for them, desperate to get out of this situation before the man could say anything. Getting noticed was the last thing he wanted. But instead of stepping around him or brushing him off, the man crouched down beside him. "Here, let me help," he said, reaching for a bottle and handing it to Tad. His voice was calm, kind, not annoyed, not impatient, just understanding. Tad hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to grab his bag and disappear. But there was something about the way the man spoke, the way he didn't immediately dismiss him, that made him pause. "You collect these for recycling, right?" the man asked, studying one of the bottles before handing it back. "My grandmother used to do the same thing, said it was honest work, even if some people looked down on it." Tad froze, his grip tightening on the bottle. Most people either pretended not to see what he was doing or gave him those pitying looks that he hated. But this man, he spoke like he understood. For the first time, Tad really looked at him. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with sharp but kind eyes and a strong jaw. His suit probably cost more than 6 months' rent at the apartment they had lost. But he wasn't acting like he was too important to be kneeling on the pavement helping a kid pick up trash. "My name's JD, the man said, holding out his hand. "And you are?" Tad hesitated. Giving his real name had always felt risky. His mother had warned him over and over about talking to strangers, about being careful who he trusted. But something about JD's steady gaze made him feel safe. "Tad," he said finally, gripping his bag of bottles tightly. JD nodded, glancing toward the food tables. "You know," he said casually, "they've got extra lunches over there, more than they need. Would be a shame for them to go to waste." Tad stiffened. He knew what JD was suggesting, and he didn't like it. "I don't need—" "Everyone needs lunch," JD interrupted gently. "Come on, I'll walk with you." Tad should have said no. He should have grabbed his bag and disappeared into the crowd. But the mention of food, the gnawing hunger twisting his insides, and the simple way JD had spoken, like he wasn't offering charity, just a normal thing people did, made him hesitate. "My mom?" he blurted suddenly, surprising himself. She needs food more than me." JD's expression shifted just slightly, something flickering behind his eyes. "Where is she?" The question made Tad's pulse quicken. He knew better than to answer. The wrong words could mean social services, police, being taken away. But something in JD's voice wasn't prying. It was something else. Concern, maybe even something like understanding. "She's sick," Tad whispered, barely audible over the rally's noise. "And we don't have anywhere else to go." JD's face changed. Not pity, not shock, just something deep and distant, as if he were remembering something long buried. "Let me grab some food first," JD said, his voice still gentle but firm. "Then we can talk about your mom." Tad's heart pounded. He should run. His mother had always said to run when adults asked too many questions. But his feet stayed rooted to the spot as JD walked to the food table, speaking quietly to a volunteer. A moment later, the woman nodded and started filling a large paper bag. JD returned with the bag and a couple of bottles of water. "Let's find somewhere quieter to talk," he suggested. Tad swallowed hard, still unsure if he was making a huge mistake. But as he followed JD away from the crowd, gripping the bag of food like a lifeline, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Tad followed JD away from the noise of the rally, gripping the paper bag of food so tightly that his fingers ached. His mind was racing, torn between instincts screaming at him to run and the simple, undeniable truth that JD had given him food without asking for anything in return. That was rare. People always wanted something. Answers, explanations, proof that he and his mother were really struggling. But JD hadn't pried. Not yet, anyway. Tad kept his eyes on the pavement as they walked, trying to decide whether trusting this man, even just a little, was the right thing to do. They reached a quiet bench at the edge of the plaza, away from the throngs of people chanting slogans and waving signs. JD sat down, setting his own water bottle beside him. But he didn't rush Tad to do the same. Instead, he simply gestured toward the bag. "Go ahead. Eat something." Tad hesitated. Nothing in life was free. He had learned that the hard way. But he was starving, and his mother needed food even more than he did. Slowly, he opened the bag, peeking inside. There were 2 sandwiches, a banana, a granola bar, and a small bottle of orange juice. More than he had eaten in the past 2 days combined. He swallowed hard, his hunger overpowering his caution, and carefully pulled out one of the sandwiches. He unwrapped it, taking small, measured bites, forcing himself not to devour it too quickly. JD watched him for a moment, but didn't push. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said conversationally, "you remind me of myself when I was your age." Tad stiffened mid-bite, his grip on the sandwich tightening. He had heard that kind of thing before, usually from people who didn't really understand what it meant to be hungry, to be cold, to live every day in fear of losing the only thing keeping you safe. But there was something different about the way JD said it. It wasn't an empty platitude. It sounded real. JD reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded photo. He held it out, and after a long hesitation, Tad took it. The picture was old, faded at the edges, but he could still make out the image of a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, standing next to an older woman. The boy's clothes were worn, his shoes barely holding together, but what struck Tad most was the look in his eyes. It was the same look Tad saw in his own reflection every morning, a mix of exhaustion, wariness, and the kind of resilience that came from knowing no one was going to save you except yourself. "That's me and my grandmother," JD said. "We didn't have much growing up. Moved around a lot, stayed with friends, sometimes in places we weren't supposed to. There were times we didn't know where our next meal was coming from. Times I felt like no one saw us at all." Tad studied the picture, then glanced up at JD. He wasn't sure what to say. No one had ever shared something like this with him before. Most adults either ignored his situation or acted like they understood when they didn't, but JD might actually get it. "I know it's not easy to trust people," JD continued, his voice steady. "And I'm not here to make you do anything you don't want to, but I do want to help, real help, not just a meal for today." Tad's stomach clenched, not from hunger this time, but from uncertainty. Help always came with strings, promises that led to disappointment. His mother had applied for assistance so many times, only to be denied or told to wait. They had slept in shelters that turned them away after a few days, stayed with people who had said they could help but eventually asked them to leave. The idea that someone would actually follow through on an offer of help felt impossible. JD must have seen the hesitation in his face because he leaned back slightly, giving Tad space. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said, "but I want to meet your mom. See if there's a way we can figure something out." Tad's heart pounded. That was the risk. Letting JD meet his mother meant exposing their situation, letting someone into the fragile, carefully guarded world they had built in that old Honda. His mother had warned him over and over about trusting strangers, but JD had already given him food, had listened, had shared something real about himself, and more than anything, Tad was so tired of doing this alone. "She's parked behind the old Kmart," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She's sick." JD nodded, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. "Let's go then." The walk back to the car felt longer than usual. Tad kept glancing at JD, searching for any sign that this was a mistake. But JD didn't push, didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just walked beside Tad, carrying the bag of food without making a big deal out of it. When they finally reached the lot, the old Honda sat where Tad had left it, the windows fogged from the cold. His mother was still inside, wrapped in blankets. Tad hesitated before tapping on the glass. "Mom?" he called softly. "It's me." The blanket shifted, and a moment later, Marina Mitchell's tired face appeared, her eyes widening when she saw JD standing behind her son. She struggled to sit up, wincing at the effort, and immediately her guard went up. "Who's this?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "It's okay, Mom," Tad said quickly. "This is JD. He helped me get food." Marina's gaze flickered to the paper bag, then back to JD, her weariness not easing. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Vance," she said carefully, "but we're fine." JD didn't argue. "I believe you," he said simply. "But if you're willing, I'd like to talk." Marina studied him for a long moment. Tad could see the battle in her expression. Pride against desperation, caution against the undeniable need for help. Finally, she sighed and unlocked the door. "All right, but just for a few minutes." JD nodded and stepped forward, crouching down so he was at eye level with her. "Tad told me you're a nurse," he said. "Was," Marina corrected bitterly. "Before my hands stopped working the way they should." JD glanced at the prescription bottle sitting in the cup holder. "Lupus." Marina's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know about that?" JD nodded. "My mother had it too. Different circumstances, but I've seen what it can do." Something in Marina's expression softened just slightly. "And what exactly do you want to do for us, Mr. Vance?" "I want to help," JD said simply. "Not with handouts, with real solutions. I know some people, good people, who specialize in cases like yours: housing, medical assistance, disability paperwork. The kind of help that lasts." Marina looked away, her hands tightening around the blanket. "We've heard all that before," she muttered. "I know," JD said. "And I know how easy it is to stop believing in promises. But what if this time it's real?" A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, Marina exhaled. "All right," she whispered. "Tell me more." Marina sat in the passenger seat of the old Honda, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the blanket draped over her lap. She had spent months guarding herself, convincing Tad that they would get through this on their own, that they didn't need anyone's help. But as she looked at JD Vance, sitting calmly outside her car, speaking in a way that didn't feel rehearsed or full of empty promises, she felt something shift inside her. She had seen the type before: volunteers, charity workers, social workers who meant well but couldn't follow through, people who said they wanted to help but never understood what it really meant to be homeless. JD didn't look like them. He didn't look like a man who had ever struggled for a meal or a warm bed. And yet, the way he spoke, the way he had knelt to help Tad pick up those bottles, the way he had listened instead of assumed, it made her pause. Maybe, just maybe, this time was different. JD reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card, extending it toward her. "This is the number for a friend of mine," he said. "Carmen Rodriguez. She runs a housing and medical assistance program here in Columbus. She's helped a lot of families in situations just like yours." Marina hesitated before taking the card, running her fingers over the raised lettering. She had seen so many of these caseworker numbers, shelters, organizations promising help that never came, but she forced herself to listen. "She can get you into emergency housing today," JD continued. "Not a shelter, an actual apartment. It won't be big, but it'll be warm, safe, and it'll give you time to focus on your health without worrying about where you're going to sleep every night." Marina felt Tad shift beside her, his wide eyes darting between JD and her, waiting for her response. He wanted her to say yes. She could see it in the way he clutched the paper bag of food, his fingers gripping it like a lifeline. He had spent months being the strong one, searching for bottles, making sure she ate before he did, pretending that he wasn't scared when he was. And now, someone was offering help. Not just for her, but for him, too. Still, the fear lingered. "We've been through this before," Marina said quietly. "Paperwork, wait lists, promises that don't go anywhere. I applied for disability months ago. They denied it. We tried staying with people. It never lasts. What makes this different?" JD met her gaze without hesitation. "Because this isn't just a name on a form or a waiting list. Carmen's team specializes in cases where people fall through the cracks. She can help get your disability appeal pushed through. She works directly with landlords who set aside units for medical cases like yours. And she has a team of advocates who know exactly how to navigate the system. You won't be doing this alone anymore." Marina's breath hitched. Alone. That was the word that stuck, because no matter how hard she had tried to convince herself that she and Tad were getting by, the truth was they had been alone for so long, too long. She looked at her son. His face was thinner than it had been last year, his jacket too small, barely kept him warm. He had given up so much just to make sure she had food, had taken on burdens no child should have to carry. Maybe if she said yes, if she took this chance, she could finally give something back to him. "Okay," she whispered. Then, stronger, "Okay, but I need to meet this Carmen first. I need to know she's real." JD nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "That's fair. I'll call her now." Within minutes, JD had Carmen on speakerphone. Her voice was warm, direct, full of the kind of confidence that came from someone who had done this before. She asked Marina about her medical history, about Tad's school situation, about what kind of immediate assistance they needed. And when Marina mentioned the disability denial, Carmen simply said, "We'll fix that." No hesitation, no doubt, just a statement of fact. An hour later, JD was driving them to the Community Assistance Network's office. Marina still felt like she was in a dream, like at any moment she would wake up back in the cold car, realizing this had all been another false hope. But when they pulled up to the small brick building with colorful murals painted on its walls, when she saw people coming and going, families with children, volunteers carrying supplies, she felt something in her chest loosen just a little. Maybe, just maybe, this was real. Inside, Carmen met them at the door. She was a petite woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked Marina over quickly, assessing, before reaching out and squeezing her hand. "You made the right choice coming here," she said. "Let's get you settled." The next few hours were a blur of paperwork and hushed conversations. Carmen's team worked like a well-oiled machine. Within minutes, they had Marina's medical records gathered, her previous disability applications reviewed, and a new appeal already in the works. They had a caseworker scheduled to meet with her in the coming days, and a doctor's appointment set up at a clinic that worked with low-income patients. But the biggest moment came when Carmen pulled out a key. "This is for you," she said, placing it in Marina's palm. "One-bedroom unit, quiet neighborhood, safe. Yours for at least 3 months while we get everything else sorted." Marina stared at the key, her hands trembling. She hadn't held a key to her own home in so long. Tad was the first to break the silence. "We have a place," he whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it disappear. "You have a place," Carmen confirmed. Tad turned to his mother, his face full of something Marina hadn't seen in months. Hope. "Mom," he said, barely able to contain the emotion in his voice, "we have a home." That night, as Marina and Tad stepped into their new apartment for the first time, she felt something inside her crack open. The space was small, just a living room, kitchenette, bathroom, and bedroom. But it was warm. It had a real bed, real walls, a door that locked. JD carried in a box of groceries. "Housewarming gift," he said lightly, placing it on the counter. Marina swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," JD said simply. "Just get better. Get settled. And when you can, help someone else, the way we helped you." Marina nodded, blinking back tears. For the first time in months, she believed things could change. She believed that maybe, just maybe, she and Tad had a future. And for the first time in months, she let herself hope. The first night in their new apartment, Marina Mitchell lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of her son beside her, the unfamiliar warmth of real shelter, the quiet hum of the heater, the knowledge that she and Tad wouldn't have to wake up shivering in the backseat of a car. It was overwhelming. She had spent so long convincing herself that they just needed to hold on a little longer, that she could fix everything on her own, that accepting help was weakness. But tonight, for the first time in months, she didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to be strong just to survive. They had a place to sleep that wasn't made of worn leather seats and piles of blankets. And it was because someone had chosen to see them, to offer a hand without expecting anything in return. And as much as she hated to admit it, she knew now that she never could have done this alone. In the morning, Tad woke up first, startled by the brightness of sunlight streaming through real windows, not the dull glow through fogged car glass. He blinked, momentarily confused by the feel of soft sheets beneath him, the scent of clean fabric instead of the stale air of their old Honda. For a moment he thought it was a dream, but then he turned his head and saw his mother still asleep. Her face relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months. No tension, no worry creasing her forehead. She looked peaceful. It was the first time in a long time that Tad didn't feel the need to be the one watching over her. They spent the first few days in quiet disbelief, adjusting to the idea that this wasn't temporary, that they wouldn't have to move again in the middle of the night, that no one would knock on their window and tell them they couldn't stay. JD visited often, checking in, making sure Marina was settling into her medical appointments, and that Tad had everything he needed for school. Carmen worked tirelessly to push Marina's disability application forward, cutting through the bureaucratic red tape with the determination of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. And slowly, life started to take shape again. Tad returned to school, nervous at first, unsure how to explain where he had been or why he had disappeared for so long. But Roosevelt Middle was welcoming, and the teachers, who had already been briefed by Carmen's team, made sure he didn't feel out of place. For the first time in months, he had notebooks, pencils, a backpack that wasn't falling apart. He sat in a real classroom instead of spending his days in the library, pretending to be just another kid with a home to go to. He still carried the weight of everything that had happened, but now it felt a little lighter. And then there was the food bank. It had started as something simple. Carmen had asked if he wanted to help sort donations one afternoon while his mom was at a doctor's appointment. He said yes, not really expecting much, but then he saw the way people's faces lit up when they received a box of food, the way parents held their children a little closer, relief flooding their expressions. He had been on the other side of that moment before. He knew what it felt like to be starving, to need help but be too afraid or ashamed to ask for it, and now here he was, standing behind the table, handing out bags of rice and canned vegetables, making sure that no kid had to go to bed as hungry as he had been. It became a routine. Every Wednesday after school, Tad went straight to the food bank. He learned how to organize shipments, how to pack food boxes efficiently, how to recognize the quiet signs of people who were struggling but didn't know how to say it out loud, and with each shift, something inside him healed a little more. One afternoon, as he was stacking crates of canned soup, JD walked in carrying a box of donations. Tad grinned when he saw him. "You're late," he teased. JD smirked, setting the box down. "Traffic." He pulled out a can and inspected the label. "I hear you're becoming quite the expert around here." Tad shrugged. "It's nice to help. Feels good." JD nodded, watching as Tad went back to work. You know, he said after a moment, when I was your age, someone did the same for me. Tad paused, glancing up. JD rarely talked about his past, but when he did, Tad listened. There was a woman named Margaret, JD continued. She found my mom and me when we had nowhere else to go. She didn't just give us food or a place to sleep, she gave us a way forward, a path out. She taught my mom how to fight for what we needed, how to navigate a system that wasn't built for people like us. And because of her, my life changed. Tad tilted his head. Is that why you help people now? JD smiled. It's part of it, but more than that, it's because I know how easy it is to slip through the cracks, how quickly things can go from bad to worse. People helped me when they didn't have to. Now I do the same, he paused, then added, and maybe, one day, you'll do the same too. Tad thought about that as he handed a bag of groceries to a woman with tired eyes and a small child clinging to her leg. The woman muttered a quiet, "Thank you." And Tad smiled, realizing how much those words had meant to him not long ago. As the weeks went on, Marina's health improved. The new medication was helping, and for the first time in a long time, she could move without pain. She started attending job training programs, preparing for the day she could return to work. Tad continued with school, slowly rebuilding the life he had thought was lost forever, and then, one day, Carmen called with news. The disability appeal had been approved. Not only would Marina receive regular payments, but they would be able to transition into permanent housing, no more temporary solutions, no more wondering when they would have to leave. Tad was in the middle of his shift at the food bank when his mom called to tell him. He nearly dropped the crate he was carrying, his heart pounding. For real? He asked breathlessly. For real, Marina said, and for the first time in a long time her voice was steady, confident. We did it, baby. We're finally okay. That night, Tad sat in their small apartment, looking around at the space that had become their home, and thought about how different life had been just a few months ago. How a single moment, crashing into JD at that rally, had changed everything. How one act of kindness had started a ripple effect that had carried them to this moment. And he knew, deep in his bones, that JD was right. One day, he would help someone the way JD and Carmen had helped him. Because kindness didn't just stop with one person. It spread, like ripples in water, reaching places you never expected. And that, he realized, was how change really happened. 6 months ago, Tad never could have imagined this moment. Sitting in a real living room, in a real apartment, with his mom looking healthier than she had in over a year. The light streaming through the window wasn't filtering through a cracked windshield, and the air wasn't thick with the stale scent of too many nights spent in the same cramped space. Instead, the room smelled like fresh laundry and the faint scent of coffee from the kitchen. His mother sat across from him, sorting through paperwork with a small, hopeful smile on her face, a sight that had once felt impossible. The weight that had pressed against their shoulders for so long had finally started to lift, and it all traced back to a single moment, one unexpected encounter at a political rally that had set everything in motion. JD had promised real help, not just a temporary fix, and for the first time in their lives, someone had actually followed through. Tad had never thought much about what it meant to truly start over. For months, he and his mom had been stuck in survival mode, focused only on getting through the next day, the next meal, the next night, without being forced to move again. But now, with the disability appeal approved, stable housing secured, and his mom slowly regaining her strength, he realized that their future wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, and that thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. The next big change came faster than he expected. Carmen had been working behind the scenes to find a more permanent housing situation, and one afternoon she called with news that left Marina speechless. "We found you an apartment," she said, her voice warm with excitement. "A 2-bedroom unit in an income-based housing program, first floor, no stairs, completely accessible for your medical needs. You won't have to move again." Marina had nearly dropped the phone. Tad had watched her eyes fill with tears, not the kind he had gotten used to seeing when things felt hopeless, but the kind that came when something long prayed for finally arrived. "A real home," she had whispered. A real home, Carmen had confirmed. Moving day came with a mix of emotions. Their temporary apartment had been a lifeline, a place of safety when they needed it most, but this was different. This was stability. This was a future. JD showed up early as he always did, carrying a box labeled Housewarming Essentials, filled with things they hadn't even thought to buy: kitchen towels, a toolkit, a welcome mat that read "Home Sweet Home." Tad grinned when he saw it. "You really thought of everything," he said. JD smirked. "I try." As they unpacked, Tad took a moment to walk through the new apartment, running his fingers over the smooth walls, opening and closing doors just because he could. His room, was small, just big enough for a bed and a desk, but to him it felt like a palace. No more sleeping in a passenger seat, no more shifting piles of blankets in the middle of the night to stay warm. This was real. That evening, as they sat on their couch, an actual couch, not the backseat of a car, JD leaned forward with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "there's something I wanted to talk to you both about." Marina glanced up, sipping the tea Carmen had left for her. "What's on your mind?" JD rubbed his chin. "The foundation I work with, the one that helped connect you to Carmen's team, we're expanding. We need people who understand what it's like to go through this system, people who can help families the way you were helped." He looked at Marina. "Would you be interested in a part-time position, helping other parents navigate medical advocacy, housing resources?" Marina's lips parted in surprise. "You want me to help?" "Who better?" JD asked simply. "You've lived it. You know what it feels like. Who better to guide someone else through it?" Marina exhaled, setting her mug down. "I don't know. I haven't worked in so long, and my health, which is why it's part-time," JD said. "Flexible hours, remote options, and when you're ready, we can look into medical retraining programs so you can get back into nursing if that's something you still want." Tad could see the war in his mother's eyes, hesitation, fear, but also something else: hope. Finally, she nodded. "I'd love that." JD grinned. "Good. We'll get you started next week." Then he turned to Tad. "And as for you," Tad raised an eyebrow. "Me?" JD leaned back, studying him. "You've been working at the food bank every week, right?" Tad nodded slowly. "Well," JD continued, "there's a new initiative starting, a mentorship program for kids who've experienced homelessness, pairing them up with someone who's been through it, someone who can show them that their situation isn't permanent. I was thinking, maybe you'd like to be part of that." Tad blinked, the idea settling in his mind. He thought about the scared boy he had been just months ago, the one who had clutched a bag of empty bottles, hoping for enough money to buy a loaf of bread. He thought about all the times he had felt invisible, unheard, like no one saw him or cared about what happened to him. And then he thought about JD, about Carmen, about the way everything had changed because someone had noticed him, had decided his story wasn't just another statistic. Slowly, Tad smiled. "Yeah," he said, "I'd like that." A week later, he found himself standing in the lobby of the community center, waiting to meet the boy he had been paired with. Carmen had told him his name was Alex, 8 years old, quiet, nervous. He and his mother had just gotten into emergency housing, and he was struggling to adjust. When the door opened and a small, wide-eyed boy walked in, clutching his mother's hand, Tad recognized that look instantly. The same look he had worn when JD had first offered to help him, the look of someone who didn't yet believe that things could get better. Tad stepped forward and held out his hand. "Hey, Alex, I'm Tad." Alex hesitated before shaking his hand. "Hi." Tad smiled, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. "You like soccer?" Alex nodded cautiously. "There's a park around the corner," Tad said. "Want to go kick a ball around?" Alex glanced up at his mother, who gave him a reassuring nod. Slowly, the boy looked back at Tad and nodded. "Okay." As they walked toward the door, Tad glanced over his shoulder at JD, who was watching with a knowing expression, and in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about his mom or their new apartment or their second chance. This was the ripple effect JD had talked about, the way kindness carried forward, changing one life at a time. And just like that, another cycle began. Life often takes unexpected turns, and for many, hardship arrives without warning. The story of Tad and his mother reminds us of the fragile nature of stability and how quickly circumstances can change. One of the most important lessons we can take from their journey is the power of compassion and human connection. In a world where it is easy to overlook the struggles of others, this story reminds us that small acts of kindness, whether it's offering a meal, listening without judgment, or guiding someone toward real help, can have ripple effects far beyond what we imagine. JD saw Tad when most would have ignored him, and because of that one moment of recognition, an entire life was changed. For older generations, this story carries an even deeper meaning. Many of us have seen or experienced struggles firsthand, whether it was financial hardship, illness, or simply moments in life where we felt invisible. We understand that hard times do not define a person, but how we respond to those moments does. It is easy to assume that someone else will step in to help those in need, but what if we were the ones meant to make a difference? Whether it is through mentoring, volunteering, or simply extending a helping hand to someone struggling, the legacy we leave behind is not built on wealth or achievements, but on the lives we touch. This story also teaches us the importance of dignity in helping others. Too often, assistance is given with an air of superiority, making those in need feel ashamed of their circumstances. But true kindness, as shown by JD and Carmen, does not pity, it empowers. It does not just give temporary relief, it creates pathways for people to regain their independence and rebuild their lives. The greatest gift we can offer is not just material support, but the reassurance that no one is alone in their struggles. Lastly, the story highlights the idea that help is not a one-way street. Tad and his mother were once on the receiving end of generosity, but as soon as they found stability, they turned around and helped others. This is the essence of a meaningful life, using our experiences, our struggles, and our victories to uplift those who come after us. No matter our age, our background, or our resources, we all have something to give. A kind word, a warm meal, a piece of advice, all of these can change a life in ways we may never fully understand. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that when we help others, we don't just change their lives, we enrich our own.